Midnight, in a federal courtroom, packed and streamed to over 62 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is blindsided by Justice Clarence Thomas. Without allowing her a single word in her own defense, he strips her of her seat and bans her from running for office for 10 years. 0:24, yet just 5 minutes later, she turns the entire hearing on its head, pulling out a sealed envelope that reveals what the court never wanted the public to see. Hidden relationships, secret luxury gifts, and rulings that now look like deals. The nation erupts, the judge is shaken, and the very foundation of the system begins to crack. 0:48, what did Jasmine say that left the most powerful men in the room completely silent? Stay with us. Every second of this story is worth your time. It was just past 8:15 a.m. when Jasmine Crockett stepped through the towering glass doors of the Atlanta Federal Courthouse. The frost hadn't yet melted from the marble steps, but the chill awaiting inside had nothing to do with weather. 1:13, outside, her name was plastered across every journalist's tablet. Asterisk Crockett accused of ethics violation. Hearing in 45 minutes, asterisk no prior notice, no preparation, just a single email at midnight summoning her to answer for a charge so vague it bordered on fiction. Improperly accepting charitable donations through Hope Forward, the same program that had fed thousands during the pandemic. 1:37, she arrived with nothing but her composure and a briefcase. What no one could explain, even now, is why Justice Clarence Thomas, a sitting member of the United States Supreme Court, was the one presiding. This was not a federal appeal. This was not a constitutional challenge. 1:58, this was a basic ethics hearing wrapped in legal theater. Yet there he was, seated behind the elevated bench in his black robe, unsmiling, his eyes low and heavy. A hush followed him into the room, more fear than respect. The air turned tight. Jasmine's attorney leaned in and whispered, "This isn't a hearing. It's a setup." 2:22, Jasmine stood as the clerk read out the charge. She raised her hand to speak, but Thomas cut her off mid-breath. "This is not a forum for grandstanding," he said, the words dry and final. She tried again to clarify, to ask for time to review evidence, to defend the integrity of Hope Forward. Again, the gavel struck. "You are not entitled to editorialize," he snapped. 2:52, it wasn't just unorthodox, it was authoritarian. Every safeguard of due process, every norm of fairness, was dismantled in real time before a silent courtroom and a live-streamed audience of millions. And then, without witness testimony, without cross-examination, without even a formal motion to deliberate, came the blow. "It is the decision of this court." 3:18, Thomas declared that Representative Jasmine Crockett is suspended from her office and barred from seeking or holding any elected position for a period of 10 years. No hesitation, no emotion, just a verdict that struck with surgical cruelty. A gasp rippled through the courtroom like thunder behind glass. A woman in the gallery dropped her coffee. 3:41, one young man shouted, "This is insane," before being escorted out. The cameras didn't blink. Reporters typed like stenographers at war. But Jasmine remained still. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. Her stillness was louder than any protest. It wasn't acceptance. It was restraint, because she knew something the court didn't. This wasn't the end of her fight. For 07, it was the beginning of their exposure. Outside, within moments, headlines screamed across every screen. Asterisk Crockett silenced. Thomas delivers stunning blow. Justice or ambush. Power protecting power, asterisk, and buried between lines of speculation, one quote from a Georgetown law professor summed up the nation's unease: "This wasn't a legal proceeding. It was a warning." 4:35, a warning to every voice that challenges comfort, wealth, and legacy. What Jasmine had just endured wasn't merely unjust. It was designed to be humiliating. But beneath the silence of her exit, something was brewing, something no robe, no bench, no billion-dollar alliance could contain. 5:01, as the echo of the gavel faded and the official verdict sealed her political fate, Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward, not to conclude the hearing, but to humiliate her. What he said next wasn't law. It was personal. "You are not here because you serve the people," he said, his voice sharpened by something colder than authority. 5:25, "You are here because of partisan privilege, because your party protects its own." The words hung in the courtroom like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed clean. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The accusation cut deeper precisely because of how calmly it was delivered. For a split second, the room froze, not from respect, but from the weight of what had just been said. Cameras zoomed in. 5:50, staffers stiffened. Her lawyer began to rise but paused when Jasmine did nothing but blink once. She remained seated, hands folded on the table before her. But inside her mind, her real past began to rise, uninvited and undeniable. She was 16. 6:16, no cameras, no bench, no protection, just pavement and flashing lights. She had taken the long route home after a double shift at the corner diner in Highland Park, still wearing her name tag, still holding a bag of leftover fries meant for her younger brother. That night, 2 patrol cars stopped her less than 5 blocks from home. 6:36, you don't belong in this neighborhood, one officer said as he reached for her arm. When she asked what she had done wrong, they told her she fit a description. No warrant, no explanation, no apology. She was thrown in the back of the cruiser like she didn't exist. In the holding cell, she watched time move like it hated her until morning came and they let her go without a word. 7 o'clock, no charges, no record, just trauma tucked into silence. That moment didn't make her bitter. It made her precise. It didn't teach her to hate power. It taught her how it moved, how it spoke, how it hid behind legalese. That's why she went to law school, not to wear the robe, but to confront those who misused it. 7:26, she defended clients who had no one. She took cases no one else would. She stood in courtrooms with second-hand shoes and a voice full of purpose. While others raised millions from super PACs, she raised hope one conversation at a time, one vote at a time. Her campaign was built not in back rooms but in barbershops and church basements. 7:54, and now the men who had spent decades surrounded by billionaires dared to call her privileged. So no, she didn't speak, because words would have made it smaller. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was defiance held in its purest form. The courtroom thought she was sitting still, but something in her posture had changed, subtle but seismic. Not a woman defeated, but a woman calculating, because she knew what Clarence Thomas had just done wasn't a sentence. It was a mistake. And mistakes in her world had consequences. 8:26, and just as the courtroom settled into the false calm of recess, papers rustling, murmurs rising, something far more dangerous than noise passed beneath the table. A quiet act of defiance wrapped in gold. Jasmine had barely stepped off the witness platform when she felt it. 8:51, an almost imperceptible tap against her fingertips, followed by the smooth edge of a sealed envelope. It was Marcus Hale, her longtime ally and perhaps the only person in the room who understood the full weight of what was unfolding. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't need to. 9:14, their work had never relied on words when the stakes were this high. The envelope was slim, precise, and gold, oddly elegant, yet unassuming enough not to raise alarms. Jasmine slid it under her legal notepad as she returned to her seat, her face unreadable. Moments later, Justice Thomas called a 20-minute recess. Lawyers stood. Clerks buzzed around like wasps let loose, and the media whispered into microphones, speculating over optics and outcomes. 9:48, but Jasmine sat motionless, back straight, hands resting on the desk like a statue carved out of purpose. Her fingers found the envelope again, only this time they peeled it open. What unfolded before her was not evidence, it was revelation. The first document was a financial ledger, cleanly formatted but damning in its clarity. She scanned it with disciplined focus. 1011, * private lodging, Amalfi Coast, $156,800. Paid by H. Crow, * her eyes moved line by line, expression fixed as if she were simply reviewing case notes. * tuition paid for great-nephew, $113,000. No federal disclosure filed, * another page. * Patek Philippe luxury watch. Estimated $71,000. Hand-delivered, * Jasmine's stomach didn't drop. It anchored. 10:44, this wasn't rumor or innuendo. This was paper, dates, values, signatures. And then she saw the line, boxed in thick red ink near the bottom of the last page, * timeline cross-reference. 7 Supreme Court rulings with financial implications for Crow Holdings and affiliates, * 1108, gifts documented within 10 to 14 days of each ruling. She leaned back slowly, the weight of truth settling over her like armor. It was stunning, yes, but it was also familiar. She had seen injustice before. She had lived it. But this was institutional rot dressed in black robes and ancient precedent. She looked around the courtroom. The cameras were still on. 11:33, the American public was still watching. They had seen a woman silenced, a verdict rushed, a life's work condemned in under an hour. But what they hadn't seen yet was the moment power gets caught red-handed. And Jasmine Crockett was not the kind of woman who let truth die in silence. Now armed with proof that could shake the very foundation beneath the judge's seat, Jasmine didn't rise for redemption. She rose for something far more dangerous, clarity. 12:06, when the court reconvened, the room felt heavier. The gavel struck once, sharp, abrupt, almost irritated, and murmurs died mid-breath. Jasmine stood up slowly, deliberately, before being addressed. Her hands remained at her sides, her posture unshakable. She looked not at Thomas, but forward, like she was speaking to something larger than the court. 12:31, Your Honor, she said evenly, each syllable firm without being confrontational. I respectfully request to make a brief clarification regarding the record and the implications made about my character. Her tone didn't waver. It didn't plead. It simply existed, like something immovable. Clarence Thomas didn't immediately respond. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes flicking briefly toward the press gallery, where over a dozen reporters sat, poised with notepads, phones, and unblinking expressions. The pressure was real now. 13:10, he could feel it, not just from her, but from beyond the courtroom walls. Journalists live tweeting every inflection. Legal analysts dissecting his bias in real time. Public opinion tightening like a noose. This proceeding is concluded, he replied flatly, resting his hand near the gavel again. There is nothing more to add. 13:34, Jasmine held her ground. She didn't protest. Instead, she said one line, quiet, pointed, undeniable, then let the record reflect that denying the truth is not the same as disproving it. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, and it landed with far more weight than any objection could. A few members of the press visibly leaned forward. One camera zoomed closer. 13:56, a silence followed, dense, charged, the kind that makes even a judge question whether to proceed. Thomas glanced toward a clerk, then back at Jasmine, then at the door, calculation flickering just beneath the surface. With a voice far less certain than before, he muttered, 2 minutes. Stay within the bounds of relevance. Jasmine gave the slightest nod. 14:21, no smile, no gloating. She simply stepped toward the microphone, a folder in hand and fire in her chest, because she wasn't here to ask for fairness anymore. She was here to deliver it. With 2 minutes granted and the eyes of a nation watching, Jasmine didn't just approach the microphone. 14:43, she approached history, carrying truth like a torch into a room designed to keep it in the dark. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her words would come from precision, not volume. Jasmine opened the manila folder slowly, her fingers careful, not theatrical, as if handling something sacred. 15:05, one by one, she lifted the documents, clean, dated, irrefutable, and held them before her like surgical instruments, prepared for an operation that had waited too long. Your Honor, she began, her tone measured but unmistakably firm, I have been accused today of accepting lawful donations from a nonprofit that feeds children, funds housing, and uplifts neglected communities. For that, I was condemned without defense. 15:36, yet what I hold in my hand are records of undisclosed gifts, gifts received by a sitting Supreme Court justice from private billionaires with direct interest in federal rulings. She let that sentence settle. It didn't fall, it landed hard. She read aloud, private yacht accommodations in the Amalfi Coast, valued at $156,800. 1601, paid for by Harlan Crow. She didn't look at Thomas yet. She returned to the room. Tuition payments totaling $113,000 for a relative. No disclosures filed. No questions asked. A luxury Patek Philippe watch, valued at $71,000, delivered by hand. And all of this, she paused, lifting the final sheet, cross-referenced with 7 federal rulings that directly impacted the financial interests of the gift giver. 1634, 7. All ruled in their favor. There was no noise in the room, no coughs, no shifting chairs, just breath held in collective suspension. Then she looked up directly at him, not with contempt, not with triumph, but with clarity. "Your Honor," she said slowly, each word as deliberate as a chisel-breaking stone, "if I can be disqualified for documented contributions used for public good, then let me ask you, with full respect to this institution, who investigates the justice who receives private luxury from those who benefit by his hand? Who? 1710, holds power accountable when power wears a robe." The silence that followed wasn't just shock. It was recognition. Recognition that something sacred had just been said out loud. Something usually whispered in back rooms, avoided in headlines, or buried under layers of decorum. But not today. Not anymore. 1733, Jasmine hadn't come to defend herself. She had come to remind the court that even justice must answer to justice. Jasmine had not come to plead for justice. She had come to peel back its mask. And now, with every eye fixed on her and every screen broadcasting live, she pulled the truth into the light one fact at a time. 1758, she pressed the remote with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to speak. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the projection screen flickered to life. The first image was unmistakable. Clarence Thomas sat in the sun-drenched lounge of a private yacht, a glass of champagne in hand, the cliffs of Italy rising behind him like a postcard for a world the average citizen would never see. 1821, the watermark in the corner marked the date, May 24th. Jasmine didn't narrate with outrage. She let the photo breathe, its implications loud enough. Then came the second slide, an official court docket from the very same day. Thomas v. Crow Holdings, a case involving the interests of the very billionaire who had financed the trip. 1844, Jasmine let the two images linger side by side. The contrast didn't need embellishment. She advanced again, this time to a spreadsheet, tightly formatted, methodical. It listed 7 different rulings across 5 years, each one involving entities connected to Harlan Crow or his business interests. 1907, each one ended with a decision that favored him. And each one, Jasmine noted aloud, coincided with a gift, flights, lodging, tuition payments. Even a rare $71,000 Patek Philippe watch. "These aren't coincidences," she said calmly. "They are data points." 1932, and when the highest court in the land becomes indistinguishable from the favors it receives, we are no longer governed by law. We are governed by arrangements. Then she turned toward the courtroom and said, "Mr. Reuben Glassman, please step forward." The former clerk walked to the microphone slowly, like a man who had carried his silence too long. He wore no robe, no badge, just a gray suit and the look of someone about to lose whatever protection anonymity had offered him. 2004, he unfolded a piece of paper, hand steady but voice restrained. "I served as scheduling and records coordinator under Justice Thomas," he began, in mid-2021. "I was directed to remove flight manifests and calendar entries that linked the justice to properties owned by Harlan Crow." He looked up, the words suddenly heavier. "I was told it was for clarity. 2028, I said no. A week later, my access was revoked. A month later, I was gone." The room didn't erupt. It imploded silently inward as the enormity of what had just been confessed settled into the floorboards and the faces of every person present. Even the courtroom guards, who just hours ago had glanced past Jasmine like she was a formality, now stood stiff, uncertain. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't move. 2100 hours, she let the silence deepen until it became undeniable. Then she turned, not toward the audience, not toward the press, but toward the one man who hadn't yet spoken, Justice Clarence Thomas. He wasn't leaning forward anymore. He had shrunk somehow, pulled back into his chair like a man hoping the wood might swallow him whole. 2122, his hands were no longer folded. They gripped the armrest with whitened knuckles. His gaze, once fixed and imperious, now flickered, unfocused, as if searching for the nearest escape. But there was none. And that's when a voice, clear, calm, unmistakably human, rose from the back of the gallery. 2145, Your Honor, is there anything you'd like to say? No answer came. Not even a blink. Just the sound of a breath caught somewhere between shame and silence. And in the seconds that followed that question, is there anything you'd like to say? What had once been unthinkable now hovered palpably in the air, that the men behind the robe might finally be the one on trial. 2206, Justice Clarence Thomas straightened in his chair, or at least tried to. His fingers gripped the edge of the bench with visible effort, as if holding on to the authority that had for so long gone unchallenged. But authority only works when people believe in it, and belief was evaporating fast. The room had shifted. 2229, the silence that once followed his gavel now belonged to Jasmine Crockett. The courtroom was no longer a stage for punishment. It had become a mirror, and the reflection looking back at Thomas was unraveling. He cleared his throat once, the sound barely registering. Even the court officers, trained to maintain order, stood in uncertain postures, watching, not waiting for orders, but for history to tip. 2300 hours, then, like a controlled detonation, the voice of U.S. Deputy Counsel Arandra pierced the silence. She stood up from her seat at the government's table, her federal badge clipped visibly to her blazer, and said firmly, "Madam Clerk, please pause the session. The Department of Justice requests immediate adjournment pending review of newly submitted materials." 2328, there was no motion filed, no sidebar, just authority, real authority, spoken without hesitation. Thomas looked at her, but his gaze did not challenge. It registered slowly, deeply, because for the first time in decades, the balance of power had tilted, and it was no longer in his favor. Arandra continued, her voice level and direct, "In light of the evidence presented and testimonial disclosures, we are initiating a federal ethics investigation into potential violations of judicial conduct codes." 2400 hours 03, gasps were unnecessary now. The moment didn't need drama. It carried its own gravity. Furthermore, she added, the department finds insufficient cause to proceed against Congresswoman Crockett. The charges are without merit and are hereby nullified in the record. 2400 hours 29, at that, Jasmine, still standing, still silent, closed the folder before her with measured calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't even blink in Thomas's direction. Her stillness now held more weight than any verdict could. Thomas remained seated for a beat longer than was comfortable. The cameras, still live, zoomed in slightly as his hands slowly dropped from the bench to his lap. 2400 hours 54, he looked around the room, not with the practiced detachment of a senior justice, but with the hollowed awareness of a man who realized the room no longer belonged to him. He tried to speak. His mouth parted, then closed again. No words came. There was nothing to salvage, no ground left to stand on. And so, without a single sentence of defense, Clarence Thomas rose. 25:18, it wasn't the rise of a man in command. It was the slow, reluctant ascent of someone walking away from something already lost. He didn't ask to be dismissed. He didn't issue closing remarks. He simply turned his back to the courtroom he had controlled for the last hour, and the country for far longer, and stepped down from the bench. Every movement was recorded, every step archived. 25:46, the cameras didn't blink, and neither did the nation. Behind him, the courtroom remained frozen. No one moved. Jasmine stood like a sentinel, unmoved and unmoving, while her legal team sat in silent awe. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keys but didn't type. The security guards by the doors didn't reach for the handles. 26:11, the only sound was the soft scrape of leather soles on marble tile as the justice who once believed himself untouchable walked out. Not as a symbol, not as a hero, not even as a villain, just as a man stripped of the illusion that once cloaked him. And the cameras kept rolling because accountability, once rare in that room, had finally shown its face, not as vengeance, not even as victory, but as undeniable consequence. 26:40, as the heavy doors clicked shut behind Clarence Thomas, leaving behind only the echo of everything he didn't say, all eyes slowly turned, not toward the bench he abandoned, but toward the woman who never needed it to speak with authority. Jasmine didn't rise. She didn't need the elevation. 27:02, her voice, clear, grounded, unshaken, cut through the charged air like steel through smoke. She sat exactly where they had tried to silence her, at the defendant's table, now transformed into something far more powerful, a witness stand for the truth. "Let me be clear," she began, her eyes scanning the room not for approval, but for accountability. "I'm not here to replace him. I don't want that chair. 27:27, I don't want its weight, its legacy, or its shadow." She leaned forward, her tone steady and intimate, like someone daring the system to look itself in the mirror. I just want to live in a country where that chair, any chair of power, can't be bought by private jets, handwritten checks, and silence disguised as tradition. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. 27:54, because justice should never wear a price tag, she continued, each word falling like a verdict, and respect for the law should come from the people it protects, not the donors it serves. The gallery was still, no shifting, no murmurs, only attention taut and reverent. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't addressing the court. She was addressing the country. 28:18, every person watching who had ever wondered if speaking truth to power was worth it. And now they had their answer. And with the weight of corruption laid bare and the gavel of fear finally silenced, Jasmine did not pause to bask in vindication. She moved instead to do what her accusers never expected, rebuild the very system that tried to crush her. 28:40, still seated at the defendant's table, Jasmine took a breath, not out of relief, but out of resolve. She didn't glance toward the press, nor toward the still reeling judicial staff. Her eyes locked instead on the court stenographer and the congressional observers seated in the second row. Every one of them scribbling, typing, documenting history as it unfolded in real time. 29:07, her voice didn't rise, it deepened. I request the following be entered into the official record as proposed policy reform, she said, each word as deliberate as a hammer striking iron. The room held its breath again, not out of shock this time, but because they sensed something real, something structural, was being born. 29:29, she raised 3 fingers slowly, not for drama, but for clarity. First, she said, a federal statute mandating that all judges, state and federal, publicly disclose any gifts, trips, or financial favors on a quarterly basis. Not annually, not selectively. Every quarter, every dollar. No exceptions. 29:54, the tone in her voice didn't ask for permission. It demanded accountability. Second, she continued, an unbreachable protection clause for judicial whistleblowers. We protect those who expose corruption in corporations and Congress. Why not the courts? Without that, truth suffocates before it ever gets to speak. Then came the third, her voice slowing not out of fatigue, but gravity. 30:21, and third, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, the immediate formation of an independent judicial oversight council, fully funded, bipartisan, and outside the control of the executive branch. No judge should ever be immune to scrutiny simply because of their title. Power without inspection is not justice. It's royalty in disguise. 30:49, a quiet gasp rippled through the back row, not scandalized, but stunned. No one in recent memory had said it so plainly, so cleanly, in the very room where such statements could cost a career. And yet Jasmine didn't flinch. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. No one moved. Not a single lawmaker objected. 31:14, in fact, 2 Senate legal aides immediately began transcribing her language verbatim into draft legislative text. The court recorder looked briefly toward the acting judicial moderator, who nodded solemnly, let it be entered. No one asked for clarification. No one called it out of order because it wasn't just appropriate. It was necessary. Jasmine's proposals weren't political theater. 31:40, they were blueprints, and the people in that room, many of whom had come expecting a spectacle, now found themselves sitting in the first pages of reform. She closed the folder on the desk in front of her and folded her hands once more, not as a defendant, not even as a victor, but as a citizen demanding the country. 32:02, she finally served its own people back. The weight of what had just happened began to register in the expressions of those around her. A court officer looked down at his badge as if questioning what it meant. A young congressional intern blinked twice, then leaned forward, typing faster than before. 32:21, one woman from the House Judiciary Committee wiped a single tear, subtle but real. In that moment, the trial was over. But something far more important had begun, because reform doesn't start in private meetings. It doesn't begin in law books or editorials. It begins where injustice is confronted in public, and someone dares to say, this must change. 32:44, Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the system that tried to silence her. She reshaped it while the cameras were still rolling, while the echoes of a fallen gavel still lingered in the room, and not one voice dared to say no. And as the courtroom emptied, its power rearranged, its silence forever altered. 33:09 The real verdict wasn't handed down inside the chamber. It was delivered by a nation that had just watched the veil of untouchable power get ripped away in real time. Within minutes of the gavel's final strike, the world outside erupted. News anchors interrupted scheduled broadcasts mid-sentence. A CNN cheerin blazed across the screen, * Jasmine Crockett flips the bench. Clarence Thomas exits in silence, * on MSNBC, one stunned legal analyst whispered, "I never thought I'd see the day." Meanwhile, inside newsrooms across New York, D.C., and Los Angeles, editors shouted into headsets, reworking front pages and evening rundowns on the fly. Politico pushed the headline before the ink was dry on their draft. 34:02 Congresswoman tries for defense, delivers a reckoning instead, but it was the Washington Post that captured the truth with the brutal clarity history demands, * Jasmine Crockett just tried a Supreme Court justice. She used facts. He had nothing to say, * the live stream replay hit 15 million views in under 2 hours. 34:24 By the 12th hour, it had crossed 60 million. Twitter collapsed under the weight of hashtags that now felt more like rallying cries than trends, * #judges are not gods. #justice without privilege. #who judges the judge, * the video clip, just 1 minute and 54 seconds long, of Jasmine calmly asking, who holds power accountable when power wears a robe, was shared over 11 million times before sunrise. 34:53, and it wasn't just retweets from activists or watchdog groups. Celebrities, veterans, former prosecutors, even retired judges were reposting it with captions like, "Finally, she said what we couldn't." And that courtroom changed something. The footage looped on every screen: airport terminals, gym televisions, office lobbies, coffee shops in Kansas, and court waiting rooms in Queens. 35:19 People paused mid-conversation, mid-commute, mid-life to watch the moment Clarence Thomas lowered his gaze and walked away from the bench. For once, the silence of a powerful man spoke louder than any defense he might have offered. Late-night shows canceled comedy segments to address what had just happened. 35:46 Jimmy Fallon looked straight into the camera and said, "Tonight, we were supposed to laugh, but instead we watched history change its posture." On cable networks, the political divide blurred, if only briefly. Even conservative anchors, often loyal to the institution of the court, struggled to find a narrative that made the footage look like anything other than what it was, a reckoning. 36:12 Fox's Laura Ingraham hesitated on air, her tone uncharacteristically somber, admitting, "I may disagree with her politics, but Congresswoman Crockett demanded accountability, and that's something no American should oppose." And across comment sections, threads, and forum pages, the country wasn't just reacting, they were recalibrating. Posts poured in from public defenders, mothers, veterans, and former clerks. 36:42 A retired judge from Colorado wrote, 30 years on the bench, and I've never seen anything like that. Not just courage, precision. A moral scalpel. One law school professor assigned the full transcript of Jasmine's testimony for mandatory reading, writing in the syllabus, not just legal argument. Civic responsibility incarnate. 37:09 But perhaps most powerful of all were the messages from people who had no microphone, no law degree, no political seat. A high school student in Detroit posted, "I want to be Jasmine Crockett when I grow up." A woman in Houston posted a selfie with the caption, "For the first time, my daughter saw someone in power who looked like us and refused to kneel." 37:33 And beneath every major news outlet's coverage, pinned to the top comment, was one unshakable truth echoed over and over again: she didn't just win, she changed the rules, even Congress felt it. By mid-afternoon the next day, 3 different senators from both parties had contacted their staff to inquire about drafting legislation modeled after Jasmine's 3 reform proposals. 38:04 The buzz inside Capitol Hill was unlike anything in recent memory. Aides reported phones ringing non-stop. Constituents weren't just angry, they were activated. Calls came in not with outrage, but with resolve. * We saw what she did. We expect you to follow through. * It wasn't about Clarence Thomas anymore. 38:26 It was about a culture that had long allowed robes to serve as armor and silence as strategy. Jasmine Crockett had cracked that armor, not with rage, but with restraint, not with partisanship, but with proof, not with spectacle, but with systemic truth. And people felt that. They knew it instinctively. They'd seen outrage before, theatrics before, but this was different. 38:50, this was surgical, controlled, inevitable. By the end of that first night, over a dozen op-eds had been drafted, each one trying to capture what exactly had happened inside that courtroom. Some called it a judicial earthquake, others labeled it a masterclass in democratic resilience. 39:13, but the title that gained the most traction came from a simple blog post by a former law clerk in Chicago. It read, "She cross-examined a justice without leaving her seat." And in the end, that was the truth that stuck, because Jasmine Crockett didn't need a robe, a gavel, or a bench. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to beg. 39:38, all she needed was the truth and the will to say it where it wasn't welcome. And once she did, America didn't just listen. It stood up. But the shockwaves didn't stop at the courthouse steps. In fact, the real tremor hadn't hit until Congress, staring at a nation newly awake, realized it had no choice but to act or be buried by its own silence. 40:04, just 72 hours after Jasmine Crockett left that courtroom, Congress moved with a swiftness rarely seen outside times of war or impeachment. On a stormy Monday morning, beneath skies that seemed to echo the weight of the moment, a bipartisan emergency session was convened in a Hart Senate office building. The room was standing room only. 40:28, senators, House members, legal scholars, and journalists crammed shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the placards before them, Special Investigatory Committee on Federal Judicial Ethics. It wasn't just a hearing. It was a signal, a line drawn in marble. The committee's formation came after an emergency closed-door vote passing 91-7 in the Senate and unanimously in the House Ethics Subcommittee. 40:55, a level of consensus not seen in years. What Jasmine had ignited had become more than a scandal. It had become a mirror, and no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of it when the nation was still watching, still sharing, still demanding more. The hashtag oversight or obsolete had trended worldwide just the night before. 41:18, one congressman was overheard muttering, "We missed #MeToo. We won't miss this." Within its first 48 hours, the committee issued formal disclosure demands to 4 sitting federal judges, including 2 appellate justices with ties to the same benefactor network exposed during Jasmine's hearing. The language of the request was sharp and unflinching. 41:49, failure to provide complete records may result in immediate suspension pending further review under Federal Ethics Code. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a reckoning. Reporters descended like hawks, lining the marble corridors of the Rayburn building. As aides scurried past with sealed envelopes and expressionless faces, the committee chair, Representative Linda Ashbourne, a moderate from Ohio not known for firebrand politics, stood before a sea of microphones and declared, "We are no longer asking whether misconduct exists within the federal judiciary. 42:22, we are asking how deep it runs and who let it fester." The cameras loved her, but the public loved something more, action. Subpoenas were drafted that same afternoon. Inside chambers, white-glove clerks were ordered to pull a decade's worth of judicial travel records, private asset declarations, and sealed advisory memos. 42:53, and for the first time in modern memory, the Judicial Conference, long considered an impenetrable old boy club, received a congressional demand for cooperation under penalty of defunding. The air had changed. The fear was no longer on the faces of the accused, but on those who had enabled the silence for years. 43:18, 3 federal judges under public scrutiny released hurried statements claiming they had, inadvertently omitted, certain gifts, investments, or personal hospitality from their reports. But the tone was different now, defensive, desperate, and no one was buying it. One document revealed that a sitting judge had received a fully funded safari retreat in Botswana valued at $182,000 just weeks before ruling in favor of a multinational oil company tied to the trip's sponsor. It was no longer just about Clarence Thomas. 43:52, it was about a culture, a machinery.